Throughout history, the most terrifying punishment has never been death itself. But the delay of death to die is one thing. To wait for it, to feel it coming inch by inch over days, is something else entirely. It is a torment of both flesh and mind. And that is exactly what ancient Persia achieved when it invented the execution method known as scaphism, the boats. This wasn't a quick sentence. This wasn't a sword through the neck or a hanging from the gallows. This was punishment as a spectacle. A punishment meant not only to kill the body, but to destroy the soul. And more than that, to warn the world. In an empire where kings ruled by fear and treachery lurked in every shadow, public punishment had to go beyond blood. It had to embed itself into the collective memory. And so, Persian executioners engineered a form of death that weaponized nature, time, and humiliation into one singular, horrifying method. Scaphism wasn't just about killing a man. It was about unmaking him, bit by bit, from the inside out, from the soul to the skin. And it all began with two simple objects: wooden boats. The victim, usually a traitor, blasphemer, or rebel, was stripped entirely naked. To hollowed-out boats, shaped like coffins, awaited. The body was laid inside one, and the second was placed directly over the first, sealing the torso tightly between the two. The head, arms, and legs were left exposed. The boats were then tied together, not tightly enough to kill, but just enough to trap. Then came the first stage: feeding. The condemned was force-fed an excessive mixture of milk and honey, far beyond normal capacity. This wasn't nourishment, it was a weapon. The body responded violently. Severe diarrhea followed, vomiting, bloating, the belly swelled. The insides turned against themselves. Still, the feeding continued. As the victim defecated and urinated inside the wooden enclosure, the boats filled with their waste. There was no way to clean it, no way to shift or escape. The stench was overwhelming, and worse, it was an invitation. Next, the executioners coated the exposed skin in thick layers of honey. The face, the arms, the feet, even the eyelids and lips. Bees, flies, and ants arrived almost immediately, but they were only the beginning. The boats were then placed on stagnant water, a pond, a swamp, or a shallow lake. The sun blazed overhead, the insects multiplied, and death began. Not quickly, not kindly, but in 1,000 slow bites. By the end of the first day, the victim's skin would be blistering from the sun. Insects now covered every inch of exposed flesh, biting, tearing, laying eggs. The buzzing never stopped. It was relentless, a constant orchestra of wings and chewing mandibles. Flies fed on the honey and feces. Mosquitoes drank the blood. Wasps stung the eyes and lips. Parasites burrowed into ears and nostrils. The milk-induced diarrhea created a swamp of infection around the lower body. The wooden boats, once merely vessels, became coffins of disease. But the human body is resilient. It doesn't die easily. The executioners returned, sometimes twice a day, not to offer mercy, but to continue feeding. They poured more milk into the mouth of the half-dead victim and more honey onto the skin. They kept the body alive, just enough to suffer. Soon, maggots appeared, born from the eggs of flies. They fed not only on the rotting feces, but on the flesh itself. They nested in wounds, in the anus, in the genitals. They burrowed into soft tissue, chewing through layers of muscle and fat. But the worst pain wasn't physical, it was mental. In that humid wooden tomb, surrounded by your own waste, your skin crawling with life that shouldn't be there, something inside begins to snap. The victim begins to hallucinate. The heat, the hunger, the dehydration, the endless buzzing. They all twist the mind into knots. Many reportedly spoke to invisible beings. Some cried out for their mothers. Some laughed. Others screamed. Long animalistic howls that echoed over the water. Then the silence would come. Not from peace, but from resignation. This was the point where the person inside those boats had lost the will to fight. Not because they couldn't, but because there was nothing left to fight for. Every inch of their dignity had been stripped. Their skin was no longer their own. It belonged to the insects now. Their voice no longer screamed for justice, but for an end. But even then, death came slowly. Gangrene set in. The rotting of the lower body began to emit gases. The victim's face swelled, the limbs twitched involuntarily. The eyes, bloodshot and half-blind, stared at the sky above with a mix of horror and disbelief. Still, the executioners came. With more milk, more honey, and the show continued. By the third or fourth day, the smell of decomposition was so intense that even executioners wore cloth over their noses. The pond around the boat would now be swarming with larvae, beetles, worms, and swans feasting on scraps. The body, meanwhile, had become a battleground between life and decay. Flesh hung loose in places, the skin turned dark. Maggots filled every cavity. The victim was no longer recognizable as fully human, but still, some were alive even then. Their eyes followed the executioners. Their cracked lips murmured incoherent prayers. Historical reports vary, but some say victims lasted up to 10 days. Others collapsed from septic shock around day 4 or 5, but nearly all suffered for at least 3. At last, the body would fall silent, still empty. The buzzing, however, continued. Scaphism had done its work, not just in killing a man, but in turning his body into a monument of horror. The boats would eventually be taken away, burned, buried, or simply left to drift. The message, however, remained. Scaphism wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. It said, "This is what happens when you betray the king. This is what happens when you challenge the system. This is what we do to those who step out of line." But the method itself tells us more about humans than it does about the law. It shows what people are willing to do when they stop seeing each other as people, when cruelty becomes custom, when pain becomes power. There's no animal on earth that kills like this. Not even predators play with their prey like humans do. The worst part, Scaphism is not alone in history. There were other methods just as cruel. Linky, death by 1,000 cuts. Brazen bulls, roasting men alive in bronze statues. Crucifixion, where the bodies slowly suffocated over days. Each society had its own masterpiece of horror. But Scaphism stands out because it left the killing to nature. It let the world itself become the executioner. It turned the body into an ecosystem of suffering, and it forced the victim to be awake for all of it. We often think of ancient history as distant, barbaric, and alien. But Scaphism reminds us, cruelty is never far behind. It lives in our capacity for domination, in our thirst for justice that turns into vengeance, and in our need to not only destroy, but to humiliate. In the end, Scaphism didn't survive as a practice, but it did survive as a story. And sometimes that's even more powerful, because stories linger, stories haunt. And this story, this tale of 2 boats, a condemned man, and 10,000 flies, will never stop buzzing in the back of our minds.